So thank you everyone who is joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to be here. We are very lucky to be joined by the Morrison Lawyers team who will be sharing some insights with us today around restructures. I will now hand over to the team to start.
Thank you, Sarah, and kia ora koutou. So it's great to be having a chat to you this afternoon. So I'm Tess, for those of you who haven't met me. I'm the partner of the employment law team at Morrison. And with me, I have Sam, who's one of our solicitors, Sam Maguire, and Olivia, who some of you may well already know. We also have Isaac in the team, but he's very, very busy right now, so he wasn't able to join us on the session. So let's crack into it. Restructures, look, we're seeing a lot of them at the moment. In this industry and then throughout the private and public sector. So it's a good time to check in, give you all some tips, things to think about, either before you start this process in a perfect world, but if you're already underway, we might be able to help you catch any issues and work with you to figure out how to backtrack a little bit or fix them as you go. Thank you, Sam. So we're planning on covering some key things to be aware of, what a typical process should look like, how to best approach the restructures and the outcomes, considering and managing the employee reactions, some unique factors and outcomes. This is hugely important, and it's one of the things that we often see get lost. Processes become very tick boxy, and we see lots of claims coming out of templates and tick box processes that could probably be avoided with a bit more tailoring and just a bit more thought about how you usually engage with your team. If usually it's a text saying, hey mate, and all of a sudden they're getting a formal letter that looks like someone's pressed F12 on a computer, it can be pretty hard and it can cause a lot of tension. So preempting some legal claims where you can, and also some smart and efficient ways to respond when they arise. We've got time for questions, hopefully, and we've already had one really good question come through, so we'll address that first when we get there. So, key things to be aware of. The duty of good faith. Lots of people say, oh, yeah, good faith, employment law, good faith. And then they're like, well, what even is that? So, in the context of a restructure, what we're looking at is being open and communicative and sharing all relevant information that pertains to the process and giving the employees the chance to comment on that. It's a procedural thing, but it's also one of the duties of good faith. And it is where we see quite a lot of processes fall down. It might be that you've got a process driven by saving money, but you don't actually tell them how much money you're trying to save. That's important, because if you're trying to save 50 grand, they might have some super creative way to do that that doesn't involve someone losing a job. So it's about sharing the relevant information so the employees can actually give informed feedback, and also taking that into account before making decisions. Another element is not to be misleading and deceptive. And in the restructure space, we see that most often when the employer has very much 100% made decisions around what's going to happen, and then they work backwards through a process where there's no actual ability for the employees to comment or in any way shift or have their views considered. Not only is that, if it's ever found out, likely to be a predetermined process, it would also be a breach of the duty of good faith. It is completely normal to have thought about things properly, and you need to do that. It's just about how far along the line your thinking and decision making has gone before you're engaging with your staff. So when we're looking at these things in a legal setting, there's two key elements. There's substantive justification. So that means basically, is there a justified reason to be going through this process and reaching an outcome? The second arm of it is procedural fairness. Is there going to be a fair and proper process, meaning an open-minded process, that gives the employees the right chances to be commenting and having their feedback taken into account? So we keep saying typical with quotation marks, because we don't really like typical. Every process should be tailored to your business and your staff and the people who are going to be on the receiving end of the process. But there's some things that it does need to include. The first thing is some really good thinking around why you're looking at possible changes. What's the rationale here? Is it only financially driven? Is it kind of financial, but also there's some ways to achieve consistencies? Often that might be if you've got heaps of team leaders, but not enough projects or jobs on to justify that middle management. So you might save some money by restructuring that, but it's possibly driven more by streamlining how your teams are operating. You've got to think that through. And our chief judge of the employment court has said in a number of cases, you can't just go on a gut feel as I've got too many staff. You've actually got to pause and go, why is my gut telling me that? What can I draw out that is telling me that? And find a way to communicate that as part of a proposal. There has been quite a few cases where it's just been gut feel, it's not working. And those cases have not gone so well for the employer when they get all the way down to the Employment Relations Authority or court. So once you've got your rationale, we say draft a proposal document. There's no rule around how this has to be drafted or what it has to look like, but it's easiest to show that you've followed a genuine and proper process by having a proposal document, because that also shows that you're giving employees the relevant information that go with your thinking. That's really important. So drafting that up, it needs to include the rationale for what you're thinking about doing, how it could impact the employee, what it could mean for them, and that could be redeployment, it could be maybe redeployment, maybe redundancy. It needs to attach relevant information. So when we're thinking about that, are you introducing some new roles? If so, draft job descriptions for those roles. Remember, they should be draft because at this point, everything is a proposal. This document process can also go quite wrong when they're drafted in a way that makes it seem like the decision's already made. So we need to save 50 grand and this is how we're going to do it, but we welcome your feedback. It doesn't really give employees a sense that there's room to move on how we're going to be saving that 50 grand, right? If it's drafted as, here's our concern, we seem to be bleeding cash, we really need to find a way to save 50 grand. One way we're thinking about doing it could be to do A, B, and C, but we haven't made up our minds and we're really open to feedback from you all in terms of how that could be achieved, so we can consider that and decide if this proposal works, we might want to do something else. It's the same message, it's just how it's drafted and how it's delivered. I say how it's delivered, one, because that's the next step. You're providing it to the employees for them to go away and think about. But the other reason is that we are seeing a huge amount of employees recording conversations these days, including without telling the employer that they're doing so. So I've seen the odd claim where a letter looks perfect. You read it and you think this is a good employer, they're doing the right thing. And then you hear the recording, which is, oh, my HR person and my lawyer told me I had to do this, but mate, there's nothing that can be done here. You're out. There's no way that you can save your job. And then that type of conversation's been recorded. And so when the employee raises their claim, they do have evidence of predetermination that's pretty resounding and hard to get around. So the way that these things are drafted, but also communicated in person, it really matters. When you're providing the proposal to them, it's important to share what the thinking is and give them the document, but try not to get feedback on the spot. Employees are entitled to and should take that away and have the chance to get advice, whether that's from a lawyer or a union or a friend or family member. Whoever it is, they should have at least 3 working days in our view to go away and think about it. If they ask for more time or a little bit of time off to think about it, it's a good idea to say yes. Otherwise, how are they getting the chance to come up with the feedback that's such an important part of this process? So the next step in our typical process is that you're getting that feedback. We like to have our clients do that in person where it's possible, or at least in a one-on-one meeting, even if it's like this logging on online if you've got teams around the country or around the region. They can also provide written feedback, but we recommend offering either option to them. Some people want to just be able to talk it out. They might struggle with getting their feelings down on paper or on a screen. For others, they couldn't think of anything worse than attending a meeting and they want to do it in writing. Making sure that people have the opportunity to do it how works best for them is a really good idea. You're then going to get your feedback and think about it. Consider what's being provided. When you're in a meeting getting the feedback, it's important not to just outright dismiss anything that the employee says. Look, we see some pretty harebrained ideas come out of employees and processes like this, because they're scratching at options to save a job, and fair enough too, right? But telling them their idea is harebrained in the moment is not the way to go. You can stress test how it might work. If they say, oh, well, why don't we all just reduce to 4 days a week? Well, actually, I've seen a few businesses do that, but you can't just impose it on everyone, right? So it's just understanding what their thinking is, unpacking it without saying yes, no, or maybe at the time. Because once you've got the feedback, whether it's in a meeting or in writing, you're going away to think about it. Once you've thought about it, you're then in the decision-making phase. Now, we say that with a little bit of asterisks on it, because if you've had some really interesting feedback and you're now thinking about shifting the proposal a bit, you might need to circle back and get some more feedback on an updated proposal. If this happens, it can get a little bit complex, and it's a good idea to be getting some advice. However, if you don't have to do that, you're probably at decision-making time. Now, what the decision could be redundancies. Remember, before you hit redundancy, you need to be exploring whether there's any redeployment options for that person, for that role. That also raises the issue of redeployment into roles that remain if you've reduced a whole bunch of roles. So if you've got, 10 scaffolders and you only need 6 moving forward, you're going to need to be adding a selection process into this mix. We're going to be covering that in a slide soon, but that decision-making phase could be just an outright one-step process where you might need to add some more bits and pieces in if you're needing to explore redeployment or selection for remaining roles to figure out who is staying and who is going. Thank you, Sam. So that's a bit of a description of the process itself. We find that the processes often need to adapt depending on how the employee is reacting. One thing we see quite a bit of, and quite a bit of grief as a result of, are these template processes. So I don't know if they're a package from an HR consultancy, for example, or downloaded offline, or a friend in HR has done a process and they flick you their documents to try and save you some time and money. Look, the thought process of helping each other out is great, but using templates and following what really feels like a tick box exercise can create quite a lot of dissent within your team, or within the teams that we see being on the receiving end of this. Often we catch these processes at the end when the claims have already been raised, or partway through when the employer is saying, oh, this doesn't feel like it's going well, but I'm actually trying to do a really good job. And that's often when we'll catch it and try and help fix it and navigate back into the good direction. But basically, if you're going to be starting a process like this, remember it's going to have an impact on your team. If you're a small or medium business, or even a big business that knows your team really well, it's going to be upsetting for the people who are on the receiving end of the news. It can also be really upsetting for the rest of the staff because it can be quite unsettling. So if you've got an option to understand what needs to go in the documents, but start with a fresh piece of paper so you can bring your values, your business, the way you talk into your communications, that can go quite a long way in terms of making the employees know it's still you. This is still the business that they know, that they've been working for. It can just give it that flavour of the fact that they're not just going through a process now that the outcome's inevitable, using words that they may not understand or haven't heard you use before. And we just see a lot of people get upset by that process. We act on both sides of the fence. So we see employees receive restructure proposals like this, and we see the impact of that on them. And we also hear them saying things like, if I'd just been treated like a human, I wouldn't be coming to see you guys. I wouldn't be spending money on a lawyer if I felt like I'd actually been thought of as a human being and talked to about this in an adult way. And we see that across construction, professional services, education. It's all industries. But I think it really is something that's worth considering. So ideally, you're drafting documents with support from whichever expert you choose to use, but doing it in a way that your business values and that your personality even comes across so that the team still feel like they're engaging with you. We can flick on, Sam. Thank you. Yeah, we've got this slide here, the reasons for proposing change, but because it is actually the first thing, we've talked about it a little bit already, but it's the first thing you really need to turn your minds to. The gut feel, not great. Probably not going to go very well if an employee thinks to challenge the process. So it's actually pausing and going, okay, we're bleeding cash, or we've got all these staff on the yard, what's going on, or we've just lost a couple of contracts, or the contracts have stopped because they were with the government, whatever it is. And then, okay, what does that mean for the business? And how many roles do we think we might need? Or how many projects, have you got all your teams on different big projects and one project's gone? Does that mean that you're going to be looking at that team only? If it's a really long-term project, that might make sense. If it's short-term, but that's the most obvious one to reduce, you might need to look at grouping in other people in similar roles on different projects to figure out how to reduce the number of roles, if that's what you're talking about. I know I'm using some quite broad examples, and again, I'm really happy to chat to any of you who are going through this process at the moment or are thinking about it to try and tailor this down to your situation as well. Again, we've got how the staff might react there and what can be done to manage or at least reduce or mitigate that risk. If you've got people who are really, what about long-serving staff member who's been around for 10, 15, 20 years and suddenly they're going to find out they might lose their job? You really hope you can maybe get in front of that person when you're delivering the proposal, offering a bit of care for them, asking how you can be supporting them, not because the outcome's definite, but because you recognise that even just understanding this process might be really unsettling for them. What if they just bought a house and now they're thinking, how the heck am I going to pay my mortgage? What if they've just had a kid or a dog or something? It's just having a think, okay, who am I dealing with? What do I know about them? What could I be doing to try and look after them? And what's inherently going to be a tough process? When it comes to the legal side, the authority or court is looking at what a fair and reasonable employer could do or adopt in the circumstances. It's not what they would do. That used to be the test. So there's a range, right? And the authority in court are not supposed to try and get into your shoes as business owners or managers to decide what the exact right thing for the business is. They just have to look at it on a broader sense. Has there been a rationale? Has it been communicated? Is the outcome consistent with what they're trying to achieve in that rationale, or at least partially? And look, we've already covered a few of these bits and pieces, but things to be thinking about. How many employees are we dealing with? If you've got, 10 scaffolders and they're all in for a 10 toolbox meeting in the morning, you might want to think about delivering the proposal in a team meeting, but I would still hesitate to do that. Some people are going to react. People will react differently. Different people will react differently. And our view is that it's often easier to manage that and to look after all the different team members if you're having a quick catch up with each of them. But we do see those group meetings and they can be okay for that proposal delivery. Would never want to see group feedback though. I have seen that a couple of times. I think that's hugely risky, and I think the authority has agreed with me on a number of occasions. It's really hard for people to give feedback about how they feel about something in a group setting, particularly if you've got some big personalities and some quiet personalities. That feedback process, the feedback gathering, should always be done individually, whether it's in writing, if that's the person's preference, or in person. It could mean quite a few meetings for you as the decision maker to be going through, but it's a far safer approach than trying to have a team feedback phase. I think we've already talked largely about what should be included in that proposal, but you've got a wee list of things there. Just remember, everything should be communicated as a proposal, no foregone conclusions. Consult. When should it occur? Well, a few days after you've given them the proposal documents and the relevant information. What should it involve? A meeting, writing, Teams meeting, in-person meeting. You can be quite creative, but the key thing is to make sure there are opportunities for that employee to absorb and to embrace, to give the feedback if they want to. Look, genuinely consult. It makes perfect sense to have gone a fair way along in your thinking to actually be communicating the proposal. But we do sometimes see some really creative ideas come out of people that actually work. Um, and it's actually quite interesting for us when an employee comes up with something that we wouldn't have thought of, because we don't know your business the way that you and they might. But that the employer says, actually, that could buy us a few more months, or that could solve the problem, or man, that's awesome and creative. It doesn't fix this issue, unfortunately. So no, but actually taking the time to think about things. Sometimes you'll get feedback which is, I get it, or nothing to say. And if that's the case and you've tried to get the feedback, that's still right. Some people just won't want to engage in the process at all. We've got too long versus too short. Too short, again, with these templates, sometimes we see, 24 hours to go away, think about the process, the information, come up with your feedback, write it down and provide it. I'm not convinced in any way, shape or form that that's going to be fair or reasonable. From our perspective, 3 working days is really the minimum we recommend. And often employees will say, oh, actually, can I have another day or so? And like I said before, good idea is to say yes if it can be accommodated. Against that, we also sometimes see processes more often in the public service, but they might take a couple of months to work through. That's not great. People are sitting on the edge of their seats trying to understand if they're going to have a job at the end of all of this. They're stressed, they're talking to each other and they're stressing each other out. They're getting no work done because they're also stressed out. So it's a balance, but one that you should be thinking about with the size of your team, the size of the restructure, and getting some advice if you're not quite sure how to peg that process in terms of duration. And sometimes you need to pause the process or pivot during the process. Again, if you get that interesting feedback, or if someone suffers a bereavement, it's not going to be fair or reasonable to keep pushing on with your meetings and decision making if someone has to head to a funeral or a pangi. So that adaptability, the tailoring the process is hugely important, and it does help to avoid a lot of claims that might otherwise come through. And helpfully, we're already talking away about lots of these things as part of this webinar to date. One thing that we haven't talked about yet that's on this list is, obviously people are entitled to take advice and bring a support person or a representative to the meeting. We find it can be quite helpful to ask them to confirm if they're bringing anyone, and if they are, who that will be, at least 24, 48 hours before you're due to have a feedback meeting. Just means that you can prepare. If someone's going to lawyer up, you get that head start on knowing that, and you get the chance to do the same. If someone's going to bring someone you've dealt with in the past or someone you already know, it just means you can mentally prepare for that. I've had a couple where the support person might have supported that person in a disciplinary sense in the past and been pretty fiery. So it's a useful insight to know that that's who's going to be coming along to support your team member at this restructure feedback meeting. Because again, you can kind of prepare in advance. You can figure out how to manage hearing the representative or the support person, because if the employee wants them to talk on their behalf, they can. But also making sure you've got, okay, what do I still need to understand from my employee who's actually affected? If you've got questions, you can just prep a bit better if you know who's going to be coming. And like we've already discussed, we don't want to have anyone rejecting feedback at the time, but totally fine to explore thinking to make sure you're understanding it. I promise a selection processes slide, and here it is. Apples to apples. I don't know why we use fruit as the analogy, but we always do. So like I said before, you might have 10 scaffolders and you only need 5. Right, how are you going to choose? The key thing here is actually coming up with how you think you might want to do that, and including that as part of the proposal. So it might be, look, we're proposing to reduce our team from 10 scaffolders to 5 scaffolders. In order to do that, we're considering how we might do that, and we're proposing to use these objective criteria to create some scores so that we can figure out who remains. And then you've got to work out, well, what's your objective criteria going to be? Because the objectivity is key. Subjective would be who I like the most, who has the best attitude. Pretty hard to measure and pretty hard to do fairly. Things like attendance records, not including sick leave that's genuinely taken, being on time, any performance or disciplinary issues, any health and safety breaches. Length of service can be one of the factors, The key thing is just having a think about what you might want to use and giving the employees the chance to feed back on what you're proposing to use to figure out who stays. There is case law saying the employees will be entitled to see their own scores. You can't just go, here's the things we're planning on using to assess you, get their feedback, and then score and tell them how they ended up. You need to be circling back again to say, look, this is our proposed or preliminary scoring of you. There is also some case law that says you have to disclose other employees' scores, but I think that's incredibly important to get advice on and treat very carefully, because then you're bringing privacy into the mix. So it can get tricky here, but once you've done it once with a bit of support, you'll get the hang of it and you can do it again. Hopefully you never need to. But if you're working through this kind of process where it's not just one role or isolated roles, but instead you're conflating, it can get legally tricky, and it is a good idea to get some advice around that. Just having a wee think around how you can be supporting the employees as well. Again, we often hear from employees, if I've just been looked after, if I've been treated like a human, so-and-so knows I just bought a house and they acted like this wasn't even going to be a problem for me. If you just have a wee think about what you might be able to do to lessen the impact or to wrap a bit of care around them, that can be really helpful. And some of the more obvious ideas are EAP. There's lots of providers that do that, employee assistance, that's counselling, but can also be careers advice. It can be budgeting advice. There's lots of bits and pieces of those puzzles. Even a little bit of paid time off if the business can accommodate it, to give them that dedicated time without deduction from their pay, where they can just think about the process and what it could mean for them and come up with some feedback on it. You probably won't be surprised to know that we think you should be getting advice early. If you're going through a process you're not really familiar, or it's been a while since you've had an update in terms of the many risks and pitfalls that you might find along the way, it's not a bad thing to have a quick chat, get your documents looked at, just get some advice from someone who knows what they're doing and a specialist who knows what they're doing in this space, because it is inherently risky. People are losing their jobs, and right now it's a terrible market to be losing your job in. So people are more likely often to challenge in that scenario. And always be thinking, okay, do I need to pause, get some more advice? This has been a really good idea. Do I need to circle back and consult a bit more? Just be nimble, be open to that feedback in the process, and be aware that someone might go on stress leave and then you can't continue, or go on sick leave for 2 weeks. So what's that going to mean? It's why it's so important not to have a dedicated timeline that's immovable, and why you need to be able to be nimble. Once you'll get all the way through to making a decision, there's a few bits and pieces you can do to reduce the chances again of a claim, but also be supportive if the business can accommodate it to the employee who's leaving. And sometimes these things are the difference between an employee bringing a claim or not. So payment in lieu of notice, offering the employee the chance to decide if they prefer to be paid in lieu of notice or work it out. If the business can accommodate it, having that flexibility. Some will want to work it out, others will not probably want to come back from the day they hear that their employment might be ending. You could offer an extended notice period if someone says, oh, can I just have a couple more weeks so that I can be looking for a job and still say I'm an employee rather than unemployed. Some might say, oh, I've got this opportunity, I just want to start there tomorrow, can I do that? Having a bit of flexibility there. I mean, you can see this list, so I don't need to read it out to you. When we say additional ex gratia payments, ex gratia, Latin, discretionary. So you don't have to make it, the contract doesn't say you need to pay it, but maybe it's just a bit of a buffer to help that person while they're finding their next job. If you're being quite generous, you might want to think about tidying anything up into a record of settlement or a settlement agreement, where the employee is waiving any claims that they might otherwise waive in response to you being so generous with money or support or whatever it is you're doing. Those are legal documents that go via mediation services. So if you haven't used them before, you might want to have a chat with us or whoever else that you talk to get some support around that. If you do end up with personal grievances, get some advice, and often the best time to try and resolve them is when they're coming up. It's not, ignore it for a month or so and hope they go away. very rarely does that work. Often the best time to at least get some advice and plan out how you might respond and try and resolve it is quite quickly. And then if they're in for the long haul, that might be when you take foot off the accelerator and let them wait a little bit. But again, that's all quite strategic stuff. And it can be useful to have a bit of support in managing that. If it's not someone within your team who already knows how to do that, if you've got that, that's great. Thanks, Sam. Right, so questions. And as I said at the start, we had one come in and in advance, which was awesome. So the question was, can we have an example of some cases where a process was followed, but they still ended up at the authority or tribunal and they lost, as in the employer lost? Look, if a process has actually been done properly, completely properly, which is easier said than done, it's hard to see how the authority would find that the employee would win that claim. But this kind of thing does happen where you have processes that are run properly and you still end up with a claim and the authority can still find flaws. The two most common flaws we see relate to rationale. So incorrect financial information, for example, being used to continue with a process. You go through the process, you get the feedback, you do all the meetings, you reach decisions. But somehow employee down here finds out that the information that you based your whole plan on back here wasn't accurate. There's a case called Break and Grace Team Accounting where that exact issue arose and the decision to make that employee redundant was held to be unjustified. So the employer actually tried really hard to follow a good process. They just didn't make sure the information at the very start was correct, and that poisoned the whole process. The other thing is where there could have been a pretty good looking process, but it still fell over, is where you can try and point to predetermination. So this is one of the things around that tick box template process. Sometimes it makes employees a bit suspicious. Or sometimes you genuinely will get the process right quite a long way, but it'll fall over somewhere. So Olivia this afternoon found a great case from this year where WorkSafe was following a really solid restructure process right up until the time that they got to redeployment, and they did not deal with redeployment properly. So unfortunately, or fortunately for the employee, that whole process and outcome was found to have been flawed because they fell off once they got to redeployment. So we do see cases where employers have actually tried really hard to follow a good process. They've taken advice, and when I say it's a minefield, it really is, because often there are ways for employees to pick holes. Usually if it's been done really well, it doesn't get all the way through to the authority or court, but that's a couple of examples where an employer seems to have tried pretty hard, but still not been able to meet the threshold. Now, I can't see any questions popping up.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. And again, a big thank you to Tess, Olivia and Sam for taking the time out of your busy days to do this session with us. So from Sam, ka kite anō.
Ka kite.